For a long time, the Great Plain of Hungary has been a slightly neglected region of medieval studies. This, however, wasn't always the case. Roughly a century ago, Kálmán Szabó of the Museum of Kecskemét has conducted several investigations that seemed very avant-garde for his focus on medieval village life and medieval village churches that was published in a very influential volume in 1938. The term cultural history that he used is very important here because if you look at his work, you will see that Szabó, an ethnographer, tried to reconstruct the cultures of the peoples of the Great Hungarian Plain based on a multitude of different objects and their relation to each other and to their greater European context, that is both Latin and Greek, often focusing on small villages and their interrelations. This approach came into focus again with the work of Szabolcs Rosta, the current director of the Museum of Kecskemét, and with different topics of research leading up to the current focus on liturgical artworks. While Szabolcs Rosta conducted several excavations of the village churches already from the early 2000s, István Pánya brought in the perspective of a geographer for the greater topographic research from 2010 on. Such an element is most needed because it is often said that the archaeological finds via metal detectors are without context, but in many cases one can gather plenty of information from the location of these pieces related to the site and also on a county level when looking at their relation to each other. Before moving to the actual crosses themselves and the examination of the interrelation of these fragments in the greater context of Latin Europe, the particularities of the discussed area have to be presented. The present discussion will mostly focus on Bács-Kiskun County, which is an area that is roughly the size of Corsica, a little bit more than 8,000 square kilometers, located in the southern part of today's central Hungary, between the Danube and the Tisza rivers. The Kingdom of Hungary was Christianized at the end of the 10th century and the beginning of the 11th century. Obviously, this was a long process, and while some villages in the area are established at the beginning of the 11th century, most of the settlements seem to appear shortly after 1100, at least based on the coins. Eventually, most of these small villages and of course the larger settlements built churches, but the chronology is very difficult. What is clear, however, is that the overwhelming majority of the churches, perhaps more than 90%, of them were destroyed during the Mongol invasion of 1241, which, because of the defensive reaction of the population and their resistance, was perhaps the bloodiest conquest of the Mongol Empire. At least this is what the archaeological sources tell us about the events of 1241-1242, when these churches were destroyed. Because of these mass destructions, liturgical objects from almost 100 churches were recovered from this area, and this number increased significantly over the last 15 years, and while there has been a lot of work done, the actual number of such objects are much larger. The estimated number of the churches that existed in 1241 is above 300. If we look at the finds, the majority of these crosses are from Limoges, the Limoges area, which is, of course, was a large region not confined only to the city it is named after. These pieces were made over a very short period, in our case not earlier than 1200 and not later than 1241. Thus basically 1 or 2 generations used these. The second most prominent group is that of the Hungarian crosses, but keep in mind that some of these were probably used from, let's say, the mid-1100s or the late 12th century, thus over a significantly longer period, in some cases even reaching more than 5 generations. The number of known Limoges-inspired Hungarian crosses is the same, but perhaps originally the number of these was slightly smaller. It should be emphasized that out of all the categories, these are the crosses that were used for the shortest time, since they all have elements that were made possible only by the widespread usage of Limoges crosses. The topic of Limoges crosses in the Kingdom of Hungary has been addressed before, starting in the 1960s by Zsuzsa Lovag and Eva Kovács. It was first Etle Kiss from the side of art history, and then József Laszlowski from the perspective of archaeology, who emphasized the fact that many of these crosses were made before 1241 and not after, as had been previously suggested. While this is not valid for all such crosses, it is valid to a certain series with shared characteristics to which the pieces in the surveyed area belong to. What is new in the research presented here is mainly the fact that we have a much larger number and from a much smaller region than what was previously presented. The limited time range and topography allows us to see patterns of the market and to a certain extent taste. It is not an overstatement to say that in Bács-Kiskun County there were more than 100 Limoges crosses, perhaps even 150, only between 1200 and 1241. The number that was brought to the Kingdom of Hungary within, let's say, 25 years must have been at least 1000. While those in Bács-Kiskun County are only fragments of crosses and are only a small fraction of the crosses, they give us a lot of information. The number is large because usually churches had at least two, a processional and an altar cross, at least after the Lateran Council of 1215. There are also crosses that are inspired by different regions of the German Empire, or crosses from the German Empire, but in Bács-Kiskun County these are much less significant, perhaps referring to the fact that most of these churches did not exist before the dominance of Limoges. Apart from one special cross fragment from a monastery, all the others show rather the inspiration of different German models. These were, of course, based on extant nicer crosses, like, for example, this possibly Renault-Mosen cross from Belgium, represented by the fragments here, including a high-quality Mosen enamel of the Virgin. The corpus may have been influential in shaping the appearance of this other cross or corpus from a site only a few hours of a walking distance away. These were obviously cheaper solutions, and while the chronology of these is not clear, it seems that some churches decided to go with these more archaic pieces. The crosses that can be directly tied to Byzantium are very limited in the area, and only one can be mentioned, that of Zsana, that you see here. Returning to the second most popular option, these were the Hungarian crosses. Such pieces certainly weren't free of the artistic heritage of the Eastern and the Western empires of the 11th and 12th centuries, and are heavily influenced by motifs spreading across the Mediterranean. But judging by the specimens that we are dealing with here, we can say that they certainly managed to remove themselves from these origins and created a rustic style that was independent. Regarding the combination of Limoges and Hungarian crosses, which is the main subject of the present talk, as I mentioned, these are perhaps the most interesting, and their creation is not surprising at all. By the 1220s or 1230s, the enormous number of Limoges crosses would have created a total monopoly of the market. It seems that Hungarian crosses struggled with this, and local artists decided to make their crosses more attractive using old forms with up-to-date solutions. The best examples of these are the large complete Hungarian crosses, in the case of which they eventually decided to add figurines that are much like those of Limoges. This solution can obviously be tied to Limoges, and while this happens, they still maintain certain forms that are characteristic of their type. These are not occasional crosses, there would have been many like these. The best example is that of Ludas, just outside the county, deriving from that of Kalocsa, but enhanced with a bit of Limoges in the form of the figurines, which was discovered next to the Archbishop's Cathedral. We can also compare the cross of Tash and the cross of Szolnok. On the individual corpora, we can also trace how this process happened. There was the Limoges prototype on the left, then they started making copies in the middle that were like Limoges crosses but were without enamel, and then eventually on the right they merged the Hungarian corpus design with those of Limoges. But this can also be seen on additional figurines from crosses, as you see here, again moving from the left to the right. Another good example is the cross of Kiskun Majsa. This seems to have been made by the artist of the Cross of Bocha, which you see on the right, who seems to have been an individual with a particularly creative ideas, while the Cross of Bocha does not seem to be inspired by Limoges itself. The corpus of the Kishkumaisha cross, which was looted by illegal metal detectorists, is clearly one among the Hungarian corpora that tried to imitate Limoges, or rather that borrowed ideas from Limoges and created a unique style. In the case of a limited area within the county, one can see 3 different figurines which tell the story of the artistic development of the rural population, as well as these 3 different corpora already shown above. Here, 3 villages connected by the Danube display 3 different stages of transition from Limoges to a local style, all within one generation, as seen from the example of these 6 separate crosses represented by the fragments. So, what is behind the purchase of these objects? Is it some form of organized activity that goes through the bishops and then the distribution happens in a communal fashion? Well, even if it is, there seems to be a significant difference between the amount of money one community was willing to pay for the crosses. Instead of such a centralized understanding, perhaps it is more related to the local donors of these churches and to the rising lower nobility and their foundations. For this idea, I'm indebted to Maria Varga, who suggested looking for the answer for the particularities of these crosses in the social transformations of the period around 1200 and the rise of this local elite in the area. This would explain why there are such enormous differences between some treasuries. Churches of the same size for similar communities sometimes could afford only very cheap crosses and the minimal of liturgical objects, whereas others of the same size could have several different types of liturgical objects and crosses of very high quality. In this case, we can not only talk about the financial choice, but also of an artistic patronage. These buyers would decide what type of crosses they wanted, and this is also important because such nobility would not be particularly distant from the general population, and we can assume that they often represented the taste and decision of the community. The large number of Limoges crosses made the market very competitive, and that is why the Hungarian crosses had to adapt to the changed visual culture to modernize their work and make them more attractive. One of the best examples is the cross of Ágosegyháza, and its almost exact twin from the monastery of Pétermonostora. I think we can be sure that these were made by the same artists roughly in the same period. Surely the people of the small village at Ágosegyháza would have gone to Pétermonostora for major religious feasts, since this was a major ecclesiastical center in the period with unparalleled wealth. On the other hand, there's also another possible scenario, that they simply bought it at the same market or from the same local workshop. In both cases, what is striking is that the second richest church of the county had a cross like the poorest village. I would suggest that this shows that the desire of taste, and of course this type of figurine was on Hungarian crosses that was made to have aspects of the work of Limoges. The richest church of the present-day county also had a cross that was surely also destined for the reception of the masses and not for the canons of the cathedral. This is the example of College. The processes described here are of course determined by local circumstances, but we can assume that generally such processes were unfolding in a similar way in the Latin West and even beyond. Such developments were prominent in Central Europe and in general, and of course in Scandinavia, which were the recently joined parts of the West. For the other edge of Central Europe, this German example is interesting, especially if we compare the size and the density of Limoges crosses. The Bács-Kiskun county map, which you see there in real size, of course does not include other types of liturgical objects from Limoges. Future comparisons of this eastern part of Germany and Scandinavia with Central Europe would be especially interesting. And in contrast to these, however, we should emphasize that in our case it was the Mongol invasion, and in other cases it was probably the Reformation that really stopped time. Is here the Mongol invasion especially stopped time, but of course the Reformation is also an interesting subject for the future to examine. Thank you.